Philip Yancey tells of driving through a mountain road to his home in Colorado. His Ford Explorer hit a patch of black ice and rolled 5 times down a gully. He was lucky someone noticed his car, and he was rescued and rushed to hospital. A CAT scan revealed he had crushed a C3 cervical bone in his neck. They were going to inject a dye into his neck to see if his artery was bleeding or leaking. And his doctor said, "If it is leaking, you won't have very long to live." And the doctor put a phone beside him and said, "You may want to call your family and say goodbye." I wonder what happens in moments like that. Your heart is in a vice. You can hardly breathe. You cry out, "God, help me." And such kinds of prayer are the most common type of prayer. During the insurrection at the Capitol building in Washington, a few lawmakers were trapped in the gallery of the House chamber, and crouched low between the rows of seats, a congresswoman from Delaware led in a prayer. And we have a recording of it. It was anguished and fearful. "God, keep us safe." Or perhaps you hit rock bottom, and somehow you know that no one can help you but God. And those kinds of prayers of desperation are important and valid. But in our passage, we encounter another kind of prayer. Beside Jesus were his disciples who had left all to follow him. They were filled with optimism and good cheer. Life was platonic and happy. Jesus had preached and healed, and at sundown the crowds clamored after him. He was a hit. He had struck gold. He had found the formula for success. Conventional wisdom says, "Stay and build on your achievements." But as dawn broke in the eastern sky, he was nowhere to be found. And Mark tells us, in the morning, a great while before day, Jesus rose and went out to a lonely place, and there he prayed. It is ironic to be speaking of a lonely place in these days of the COVID. There are some people who live alone, and they know nothing but isolation and loneliness, and the 4 walls that are too near and closing in, and they feel like the walls of a prison. Some of you may be following the news about Trinity Bible Chapel north of the city, which continued to hold in-person services even after the lockdown. In an interview, their young pastor, Jacob Raum, sounded quite reasonable. He said people are lonely, and they need relief and fellowship and the strength of community. And I understand that. You can only watch so many movies on Netflix or play solitaire. Some people sink into the dark places of depression and anxiety, drink too much, eat too much, and may be a danger to themselves. And if you find yourself in that situation, please call the church and speak to our pastors or call a helpline. Don't suffer in silence. I wish we could open the church, but in the midst of a pandemic, we must close our doors. We are following provincial and regional guidelines and don't want to put our church population or our community at risk. Love demands it. It is a no-brainer. But there is a time and place when you may choose the lonely place, away from the madding crowd, away from interruption, and away even from those things which bring you pleasure. Jesus took off to a lonely place. The Greek word for lonely place is the same word for wilderness. Do you remember when we encounter the word wilderness? It is where John the Baptist cut the desert air with his cry, "Repent." The wilderness was where Jesus was tempted by the devil. And he said to Jesus, "Turn the stones into bread. Jump off the pinnacle of the temple. Worship me, and you will have the whole world." Once again, in our text, Jesus is in a lonely place or wilderness. He had not told anybody where he was going or what he was up to, and the disciples formed a posse. Finally, Peter finds Jesus. He's breathless with anxiety and excitement. "Jesus, there you are. Everyone is looking for you. Come back quickly to Capernaum. This is as good as life gets." And Jesus had to make a choice. He was at a crossroads. One road led back to Capernaum, to comfort and a good life, and the respect of all around him. Nothing wrong with that. The other road would lead to continual confrontation with evil, challenging those who lined their pockets, wooing them with stories of God's grace and love, but failing, challenging the status quo, and ending up strung up on a cross. In that lonely place, Jesus knew what path God was calling him to take. I wish I could have seen the face of Peter when Jesus said, "I'm not going back. Let's go to the next towns, that I may preach there also. That is why I came." Sometimes you must choose the lonely place, and I'll tell you why. Not merely to hide from the clamor and noise of life, but to gain a fresh sense of God's purpose for your life. We choose a lonely place to allow God's Spirit to challenge and mold our spirits, so we are deeply rooted in His ways. We choose a lonely place to deepen our relationship with God, but not to become hermits or be only consumed with the inner life. The lonely place is never an end in itself. You choose the lonely place to return to the world with vigor and with robust convictions about the direction of your life. So it was with Jesus. The next stop for Jesus was Nazareth, his hometown. It was the Sabbath, and this young, popular rabbi was invited to preach. And Jesus used the words of the prophet Isaiah to introduce himself and proclaim his bold mandate. He said with audacity, "This is why I am here, to preach good news to the poor, to proclaim freedom for the prisoners, and recovery of sight for the blind, to release the oppressed." The declaration was the outcome of prayer in that lonely place. Who knows where prayer in that lonely place will take you? Perhaps it will offer you peace and contentment in the midst of anxiety and stress. Or it might take you to places you do not expect. Perhaps the lonely place will lead you to see with fresh eyes the poverty, the greed, the injustice, the pain endured by so many, the challenges of First Nations peoples, the dangers of capitalism run amok, and the pressure to appear spectacularly successful. We cannot take on the world, but we can make progress in some small areas, one step at a time. So let me make this pivot, to some of you perhaps a startling pivot. This month is Black History Month. Ban Ki-moon, the UN General Secretary, stated that people of African descent are among those most affected by racism. It's not new news. We remember casualties to racism like the teenager Trayvon Martin or George Floyd in Minneapolis, or 12-year-old Tamir Rice, to name just a few who have made headlines. Or I think of a Canadian woman, Amy Cooper, a graduate student from the University of Waterloo, walking through Central Park last July with her dog off-leash, contrary to the bylaws. And there was this man who was an avid bird watcher who asked her to leash her dog. It was a reasonable request, but there was a problem, you see. He was a black man. And she whipped out her phone and called the police. And you can see the video recording how she screamed into her cell phone that she was being attacked by a black man. And the police raced to the scene. Didn't she know she was putting that man's life at risk? Perhaps she didn't care. She was entitled. And we might ask ourselves, why is there so much racism? Sometimes racism is fueled by fear of the stranger. We like to hang around with people who look like us or speak like us. Sometimes people speak of tribalism. From our history with First Nations and blacks, we know there are motivations of greed and material gain. And in the end, racism is often rationalized by notions of white supremacy and racial hierarchy, with the whites on top and blacks at the bottom. Could it be the challenge to you is not merely to say rather passively, I'm not a racist, but to declare with your words and actions, I will be an anti-racist. I will be an ally to those who suffer. I will put away those thoughts of racial hierarchy and will see in each black man or woman someone made in the very image of God. Do your homework. Study the issues, even if only for this month, which is Black History Month. Spend time in the lonely place. Who knows where God may lead you?